Hello, Melrose. Mayor Paul Brodeur here, convening Melrose City Finance 101. This presentation is intended to give some basics on municipal finance so that we all have a shared vocabulary and understanding of what's in our city budget and what constraints we are facing year over year. I think it's critical for everyone to be working with good data and a sense of perspective, and hope that this presentation will help us move forward. I'm here with the city's finance team. To my immediate right is Margot Fleischman, my chief of staff. Next to her, Patrick, if you could introduce yourself.
Patrick Dello Russo, the CFO, city auditor.
And Sarah.
Sarah MacLellan, the chief assessor.
Kathryn Armata, treasurer collector.
So this is the team that works together to make sure that Melrose's finance are stable during the year and over the course of years. Here's what we're going to be covering today. As you can, and we're going to try to move through a lot of material quickly, but that's why we're preserving this on camera. Folks should know that this basically is the same presentation that was done this Saturday at Parent University. So as we go through it, we're going to talk about what's in the city budget, how Proposition 2.5 affects city finances, how we use our so-called free cash, our ability to grow city budgets over time, how we pay for our schools in particular, what the 2019 override did, and where does ARPA fit into all this. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Margot to define some very important terms.
So we're going to start by defining terms. Some of these are things that you might know if you're familiar with municipal finance, and other things might be new to you. So we'll start with the tax levy. This is just the words that are used to define the revenue a community can raise through real and personal property taxes. Proposition 2.5, you might have heard about this. This was a Massachusetts law that was enacted in 1980 that places strict restrictions on the amount of property tax revenue a community can raise through real and personal property taxes. Our tax levy limit is the maximum amount a community is allowed to raise through property taxes in any given year, and it's based on 2.5% growth of the prior year's levy plus new growth. So what's new growth? New growth is the increased value of new development and other growth in the tax base that is not related to revaluation. A portion of this value is applied to the tax levy limit. And then we have an override. An override is a permanent increase in the levy limit of a community above the allowable 2.5% growth, and this is done through a majority vote of an electorate in a town. And finally, free cash are the funds certified annually by the state that come from municipal revenues being greater than expected or expenses being less than budgeted, or a combination of both.
So an important question to start off with really is, what is in our city budget? Well, for fiscal year 22, there's a pie chart up on your screen right now, and it shows how the budget breaks down. As you can see, the school department at 39% is our highest single expenditure within the city budget. Insurance and benefits make up 24%. DPW and police are each at 11% of our total city budget. However, if we can move on to the next slide, what you can see is 60% of the FY22 operating budget supports running the schools. And that is because there are certain expenses that the city side of the budget pays for, but the schools benefit from that. As an example, the city budget carries school staff health insurance. The city side, through the Department of Public Works, also carries our expenses around infrastructure, maintenance, building upkeep, so everything from painting the walls, perhaps fixing a roof leak, to janitorial services, all comes under the city side. Kathryn, if you could talk a little bit more about the city side budget and some of the debt issues, that would be terrific.
Sure. It's probably not thought of very often or not recognized that in that 60% of the pie, any debt obligations of this city that are because of the school needs are not included in that cost. That cost is borne by the city budget.
So that would be the
interest,
the interest, like the interest on
and
your
principal
mortgage,
payments,
right?
Yes.
And the city side carries the debt for all infrastructure.
Yes.
And Patrick, let's talk a little bit about how Prop 2.5 affects our finances.
Absolutely, Mayor. Proposition 2.5, it places strict limits on the amount of property tax revenue a community can raise through real and personal property taxes. So how does this affect our city budgets? In the past few years, real estate values in Melrose have skyrocketed. So we often hear, why are our finances so tight? The answer lies in the way Proposition 2.5 works. Each year, the total amount of property taxes we can collect, the tax levy, is capped at the previous year's number, plus a 2.5% increase, plus the tax on the net value of any new development called new growth. Melrose already taxes to the maximum we are allowed. This means we cannot grow our tax levy beyond our levy limit without an override. So all of our annual operating budget increases must fit by law within that limit. Many of the increases are non-discretionary and beyond our control. For example, we anticipate next year our health insurance and Medicare line is expected to grow by $746,000. That means that every other possible increase, including inflationary cost of goods and services, must be fitted into our budget around those big ticket items that we must pay for.
So we know that our budget are constrained by our 2.5% limit plus new growth, but what does that mean in the context of Melrose? Because that's true of every community. Well, unfortunately, because Melrose is highly residential and built out, we generally have significantly lower new growth than some of our neighboring communities. As you can see from the graph on the screen, a simple comparison to Wakefield, our most immediate neighbor and a community a lot of folks compare us to, shows what this means. So Wakefield's new growth is essentially, over the last 5 years, double what we've seen in Melrose. Well, what does that mean? That means roughly a capacity of about $600,000 more a year in new growth, which is essentially new money that then goes onto the 2.5 base. So that we're at about we're at 600K, roughly 600,000. And again, Wakefield, as an example, being double that. New growth for Melrose usually represents less than 1% of our total budget. For a little bit more information, I'm going to pass it over to our Chief Assessor, Sarah MacLellan, to talk a little bit more about new growth, particularly over time.
Right. So there's no way to predict exactly what our growth numbers will be in the future years. It depends on construction activity in the community, which is largely dependent on economic conditions and is therefore very difficult to predict from year to year. So this chart shows Melrose in red again and Wakefield in light blue compared to other cities and towns in our region. Not only are our numbers significantly lower than our neighbors, but you can tell from these trend lines that new growth can vary a lot from year to year.
And so as folks look at these, it's a selection of communities, 5 or 6 communities, and the reasons for those selections were so folks can understand a little bit of the capacity that Melrose has compared to other communities that have recently been negotiating collective bargaining agreements in their communities. So understand that the relative difference between Melrose's capacity and some of these other communities. Now, next very important topic is free cash, perhaps the most inappropriately named financial resource in municipal government. So if you remember from our definitions, free cash is a term that essentially refers to money that is left over at the end of the fiscal year. Some of it comes from expenses being higher than usual, and another part of it comes from when we have expenses that might be lower than expected. So for example, when the economy is strong, we might see more essentially new development than we expected. Folks might be more comfortable adding a porch or a dormer or a pool to their property, and if that grows larger than expected, it is terrific news for the city coffers. Another example where we might not spend as much as we would anticipate is if a position goes unfilled for some amount of time. When we budget, we tend to budget for an expectation that we will fill a employee slot for an entire fiscal year. If we can't do that, Obviously, we're not paying them during the time that they're not employees, so that inures to our benefit and goes into the free cash bucket. The problem with free cash is that it is somewhat unpredictable in year-over-year prediction, and so we tend to be conservative with how we plan around free cash. Patrick, if you give some more details on that, it's a really important point.
Absolutely, Mayor. It's a great point. And again, as the Mayor indicated, people sometimes ask, what does the city use free cash for? And could we use it to fund things like additional salaries? The simple answer is no, because the amount of free cash each year is unpredictable. It is responsible practice not only to use free cash to fund one-time, non-recurring expenses to avoid creating a structural deficit by basing our operational budget on funds that might not be available in the future. This slide shows a breakdown of how Melrose has used our free cash over the past 5 years. You'll see that we used to invest very little in our stabilization and our capital needs, both of which are critical to Melrose's fiscal health. In the past 4 years, we've been able to put away savings to help us weather future economic downturns and have been able to fund many necessary projects to preserve the fabric of the city using these funds. We have a complete list of all the appropriations from free cash on the City Melrose website. Just click the City Finance link. Here's a great chart up here for comparison with other communities. Having free cash is expected and routine, and there are many valid reasons why a municipality will generate it. Some say, do we have too much free cash? The answer there is no. The annual budget approved by the City Council each year is a good faith estimate of revenues and expenses, but it is never exact. We strive to be conservative, and that accomplishes an awful lot for us. The Massachusetts Department of Revenue recommends as a best practice that communities try to have a free cash balance of 3 to 5% of their operating budget. As you can see from this chart, that's almost exactly what Melrose does year after year. We are in the red, and as you can also see that compared to some of our other neighboring communities, Melrose generates fairly modest amounts of free cash, about $5 million right here. Thank you.
And so the question becomes, what is our capacity to grow our budgets? If we have limited funding and we can't use free cash to responsibly address recurring expenses, what are the other ways we can grow our operating budget? Sarah, if you can start off talking a little bit about how property taxes work. It's a little bit complicated, but I urge you to pay attention because it is super important to the fundamental way we do business in Melrose.
So Melrose already taxes to the maximum as allowed by law. We shift some of the taxes onto our commercial and industrial taxpayers, but due to the composition of our city, which is over 95% residential and without numerous large commercial properties, the net effect is that 92% of tax dollars are paid by the residential property owners. So many people look at their assessed value and wonder why the city doesn't have more money to spend given how much values have increased recently. Remember, each year the total amount of property taxes we can collect is capped at the previous year's maximum levy, plus a 2.5% increase, plus the tax on new growth. Because that number is fixed, as property values go up, the tax rate must go down. That is exactly what has been happening for the past 5 years. Residential property values have been rising and the tax rate has been dropping. This is with the exception of the year that the city passed the override, which was effective in fiscal 2020. So how much can we grow? We expect new growth will be unusually high for fiscal 23 due to Eversource finishing construction and installation of underground conduit in the city. But for fiscal 24, we will estimate based on historical trends. Again, this is because new growth is unpredictable and we have to build our budget responsibly. Last year's tax levy was just over $69 million. 2.5% of that is $1.7 million. If we estimate new growth conservatively at $500,000, that will give us approximately $2.2 million that we can add to our costs across all departments.
Thank you, Sarah. And again, we note that growth rate is significantly lower, not the 2.5%, which is statewide, but that is significantly lower than what other communities have in terms of their ability to put resources towards all the things they want to do. So I think folks know this from back in 2018 and 2019, but the only way to grow our tax levy is to do an override that would allow the community to tax above the 2.5% limit that is provided for in state law. And I would note that, interestingly, that state law came about in 1980 as a result of a citizens' referendum. So it was actually voted by the residents of the Commonwealth, granted 40 plus years ago, but it did not come from the legislature, the federal government, or the city itself. Now, when the override is passed, the amount of that override, whatever the voters agree it should be, that allows the pie, if you will, to grow a little bit bigger. It essentially resets our base so that when post-override, if we go up another 2.5%, it'll include the monies from the new levy limit. So I know a lot of people continue to be concerned about the impact of the 2019 override vote that added a little more than $5 million to our tax levy. The breakdown from that year continues to impact the budget, and here's the data right here. It's quite clear. We used almost $1.5 million of that money to add 28.5 school staff in fiscal year 20. Those positions continue to exist in the budget, and that money continues to service those jobs. $250,000 was to replace the rental income from BB School. That money has been placed in a specialized account and essentially frozen. We have a little over $400,000 for instructional materials and other supplies. And we allocated $1.85 million to pay for raises and other provisions of the teacher's contract that was settled in FY20. That contract is online for folks to see. It was essentially a 3% over 3 years raise, and the money that was generated from the override allowed us to do that and allowed us to continue to fund it as that raise moves ahead going forward. And finally, a little under $450,000 was devoted to the insurance and benefits costs for school employees that is part of the city's operating budget, as we discussed before. So those revenues continue to come in, but they service the changes that we made, like new positions and the contract increases that I described. Now, with the exception of the insurance and benefit amount, which is accounted for in the city's operating budget, since 2019, all recurring revenues raised through the override vote have been added to the school department's annual operating budget every year and have been spent every year in accordance with the school department priorities as approved by the school committee. Throughout the intervening years, and especially during the pandemic, the school department has had some flexibility to meet the needs of students in their allocations of these and other important financial resources. So the override was enough to restore cuts that had been made over the prior years, but was not so big as to allow for significant growth in our school department budget, or more importantly, services that we provide to students. And here, as a matter of fact, is former Superintendent Cindy Taymor speaking to the school committee immediately after passage of the override.
This was a restorative override. It brought us back to the levels that we needed to be at prior to cuts over the past several years. Most importantly, restoring the middle school model, restoring the directors, adding additional teachers to lower class size when we can, adding the social workers that we need to service our students. So it is very much a restorative override. At no point did it enhance us to a level in which we have a lot of extra. But we are certainly more comfortable than we were a year ago and where we were anticipating to be this year if we had not received the override. So I hope that's captured in this, and that you and the people at home understand what a difference this has truly made.
So, how does the city, in fact, fund its schools? It can be quite a complicated process, but we do have important information to share that some folks have seen before. So the graphic on the screen is from the state's Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, also known as DESE for shorthand, and shows the cost in the running of our school system over the past 30 years. The light blue, apologies if this is hard to see, is what we are required to spend on our schools, what's known as the foundation budget. That's our spending floor. That is a mandated amount we need to spend to be in compliance with state law. Orange is the state aid we receive through Chapter 70 funds, which have essentially remained flat for the last 10 years, though we did see a hopeful trend in 23. And as this chart makes clear, every passing year, the city must fund a greater and greater proportion of the school's budget to make up that difference. And here are some of the trends in state aid. From fiscal year 20 to 22, Melrose's net aid, which is the amount of money that the state gives us through Chapter 70, what's called UGA, or unrestricted local aid, and some much smaller buckets of money, and the things they charge us for, like we pay an MBTA assessment, and we also pay almost $4 million in charter school assessments. So those come right off the top. So again, the net state aid has actually dropped in Melrose for fiscal year 20 to 22. 218,912 less in net state aid than the previous year, and Chapter 70 only increased $117,000 to 1.38% from fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 22. And our charter school assessment payments have increased by almost $500,000 or 13.26% from fiscal year 21. So those are some of the challenges that we regrettably face. And again, we are hoping to see the positive trend in Chapter 70 through Student Opportunity Act continue to be a significant addition to our budget without a significant rise in some of those chargebacks that we referred to. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about ARPA investments, because that's something that people are very curious about, and I want folks to know, should have said it before, all this information will be posted, both this presentation itself and some important links, so that you can refer back to them should you need to. So the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, is, as you all know, a significant source of one-time state aid, federal aid, not recurring dollars that we can continue to spend into the future. And I'm going to turn this over to Margot Fleischman, my Chief of Staff, to go into some of the numbers here.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as you'll see on this chart, compared to some of our neighbors in the region, as the mayor explained, some of the communities that are in some of the similar situations we are, even if they are communities that are different from us, you'll see that compared to some of these neighbors, Melrose received relatively little in ARPA and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER, funds from the federal government. Per capita, Melrose and Wakefield received just under $300 per person, while other communities received much more. Likewise, with ESSER, Melrose received a modest per pupil amount of federal education relief compared to some of our neighbors. As we saw with some of our other comparisons, there's a lot of variability from town to town and city to city, with some communities having a lot more additional financial capacity based on these relief funds than Melrose has. This just shows you the same information in chart form, and you can see sort of the scale of the difference in some of the communities that received upwards of almost $50 million in ARPA funds, whereas Melrose received just under $8.4 million. We have, however, used our ARPA funds to invest in both capital and operating costs of running the schools. Of the $3.4 million of ARPA allocations benefiting the schools, 63% supported the school budget, and 37% were for improvements in school infrastructure and COVID safety. And of the allocated amount that the city has already done with its ARPA funds, we have used the majority of it, or nearly half of it rather, to support the schools. The biggest contribution has been those operational and capital costs of the schools, with other departments and areas of the city receiving smaller allocations. And you can find a complete list of all approved ARPA projects on the City of Melrose webpage.
So we certainly haven't told the whole story, but we've given folks an awful lot of information, and we really hope it is helpful so that everyone can understand and be on the same page with the big financial picture. Now, it is no secret that based on some of the accounting problems and additional cost of special education and transportation over the last fiscal year or two, we have work to do to restore that funding and put ourselves in a better position financially moving forward. You have my commitment that the City Council and myself and the school committee are going to work to the best of our ability to hold kids harmless from some of those funding stresses. However, it is going to take some time, and again, this is the beginning of a conversation, and I hope folks will weigh in with their thoughts and their ideas moving forward as we tackle an ongoing budget challenge. Again, I hope this information is helpful. I urge you to refer to the website again for the data that's here and the information in particular about what we've done with free cash over the last 5 years, so we can begin to have a better informed discussion about how to move forward. Again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to get in at the start of this conversation, and we look forward to continuing. Thank you for watching.